Good morning, church. Welcome to a Wednesday edition of Devotions from a Distance. I think it's safe to say that everyone has at least one story of a broken promise. For me, it takes me back to the days of my childhood. I recall my brother and I playing a game of mini sticks in my parents' basement. These games happened often, and as the older, stronger, and smarter brother, I won every time. But one time in particular, after I had scored the game-winning goal, my brother got quite angry. So angry, in fact, that he decided to forcefully slam the plastic stick down on the carpet-covered concrete floor, breaking it into a million pieces. The stick happened to be my favorite stick, and now he owed me one. He owed me a new one. Mom got involved, and he quickly promised that he would buy me a new one. But between you and me, he still hasn't. For me, the broken promise was a simple piece of plastic, but for some it's worse. For some, broken promises involve marriage vows, business deals gone sideways, personal secrets leaked, betrayals of trust. It hurts our hearts to be lied to. Maybe the person who said promises were meant to be broken, in fact, had it right. Unfortunately, though, this attitude has caused a lot of distrust. Nobody's surprised when a politician is found to have cheated the system. Nobody's surprised anymore when an election promise isn't completed. But even aside from devious politicians, there is deep within our souls a sense of dread that after all, even we may be the promise breaker. That even as hard as we may try, as hard as we may fight, there are forces and circumstances that are beyond our control, that mess up even the best laid plans. Trust is increasingly difficult to give, not for lack of want, but for protecting our hearts from disappointment. We've learned that people are simply not dependable. So then how do we trust God? How can we be so sure that He will come through? In a world where disappointment seems to be the norm, how can we know with any level of certainty that we can trust God, that He will do what He promised to do, namely forgive our sin and bring new life? It might surprise you to know that this is not a new concern. Even the early church dealt with these thoughts. And so in Hebrews 6, verse 17 to 18, Paul actually attends to this very question. How do we know that God's promises are dependable? He says this in Hebrews 6, verse 17 to 18. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of His promise the unchangeable character of His purpose, He guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we, who have fled for refuge, might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. In this verse, Paul is addressing the question by placing God's trustworthiness into two different factors. They are a little tough to find since Paul's sentence is a little bit awkward, but keep in mind that when he wrote this, he was most likely writing in the Greek language, and we know that translating can make things sound a little funny on the other side. The two unchangeable factors that prove God's trustworthiness are, number one, His oath, and number two, it is impossible for Him to lie. So let's start with the first one, the oath. When Paul references this oath, he is talking about the covenant that God made with Abraham in Genesis 15. When Abraham questioned God and God wanted to make it abundantly clear to Abraham how serious he was about his promise, he chose to swear by himself. That is, if the terms of the covenant agreement, the terms of His promise, were not met, regardless of who sinned, God Himself would suffer the punishment. Regardless of who let down their end of the agreement, God offered Himself as the one who would endure the consequences. And He did just that on the cross as He died in our place. We can trust God because in following through with His promise, He sent Jesus, God in flesh, to deal with the consequences of the broken covenant, and in doing so to bring new life and freedom to a humanity that is breaking under the bondage of sin. Why can we trust God? because his promise to us of eternal life is bound up in him. In other words, for those who put their faith in God, to not receive the promise of eternal life would mean failure on God's behalf. And that brings us to the second factor. It is impossible for God to lie. I may not have got my mini stick. You may not have been given what was promised to you. But we can both be unquestionably sure that God's promises are true because they are wholly bound up in his life. What is true of him is true of us. Or, in the words of Jesus, in John 14, verse 19, because I live, you also will live. Be encouraged this morning in God's trustworthiness. Thanks, church, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.